She was weeks away from walking across a stage, diploma in hand. Instead, her parents found themselves identifying her body. On the surface, it was an ordinary Wednesday night. A college student finished her shift at a local gastropub, sent a quick message to her dad, and headed to her car. She had plans. She had a future. She never made it home. By morning, the city of Columbus would wake up to news that would shake the campus and haunt an entire community. A promising young woman was gone. No witnesses. No cry for help. Just cold, quiet finality. Have you ever walked to your car late at night, tired, distracted, sure you'd be home in 10 minutes? Have you ever told yourself, I'm fine, it's well lit, or it's just a short walk? Reagan Tokes thought so too. But something was waiting for her. Not a stranger in the shadows. A man the system had already caught once and let back out. Free to roam. Free to watch. Free to choose. Reagan didn't know the man approaching her had already served time for kidnapping and rape. She didn't know he was supposed to be monitored, tracked, supervised. She didn't know he had spent days circling neighborhoods, waiting. No alarm was triggered. No officer arrived. The monitor on his ankle was just that. A device, not a deterrent. In less than 90 minutes, he would force her into her own car, make her stop at ATMs, assault her, and finally take her to a public park just miles from her apartment. There, he made her walk into the trees, barefoot, freezing, silent. What happened to Reagan Tokes wasn't a mystery. It wasn't random. It was the result of a broken system, a blind spot that cost her everything. How does someone with that kind of record walk the streets without anyone watching? Why didn't anyone stop him before she became his next victim? Before we go deeper, subscribe to Whispered Evidence. Because this isn't just about one girl. It's about how many more are walking to their cars tonight, thinking they're safe. Before her name became part of court transcripts and legislation, Reagan Tokes was a daughter, a sister, a friend, the kind of person whose presence made a room feel calmer, not louder. She was born on March 13, 1995, in Edgewood, Kentucky, to Lisa McCrary Tokes and Toby Tokes. Not long after, the family moved to Monclova Township in northwest Ohio, a peaceful place where the streets were wide, the winters were harsh, and families raised children with strong values and soft discipline. Reagan was the first of two daughters, and her younger sister Mackenzie was her mirror in more ways than one. The two shared more than a last name. They shared quiet rituals, inside jokes, and the kind of trust only sisters understand. Friends say they were inseparable. Lisa recalled that Reagan was the type of big sister who always left a note, always gave the last piece of candy, always knew when Mackenzie needed a laugh. She didn't need the spotlight, but her talents made her stand out. At Anthony Wayne High School, she graduated with a 4.5 GPA, earned varsity letters in both lacrosse and tennis, and was often found juggling a stack of books with a team jersey slung over her shoulder. Her teachers remember her as focused, warm, and quietly impressive, a student who raised the bar without trying to. She excelled not just because she was smart, but because she was disciplined. She studied late, never missed practice, and managed her time like someone who already understood how fleeting it could be. Even in high school, Reagan knew she wanted to make a difference. She wasn't chasing popularity. She was chasing purpose. Reagan's discipline and heart earned her a scholarship to The Ohio State University, where she enrolled as a pre-med student. Like many high achievers, she dreamed big. Her early plan was to attend medical school and one day work at the Cleveland Clinic. But when the reality of organic chemistry set in, she made a thoughtful pivot, switching to psychology, where she found a better fit and a deeper calling. Her goal shifted to opening a mental health practice of her own. She wasn't just chasing credentials. She wanted to help people find peace in a world that often denies it. To support herself, Reagan worked part-time at Bodega, a gastropub in Columbus's short North District. She didn't mind the hours. She liked the rhythm of service, the chatter of customers, the friendships that came from shared shifts and split tips. Co-workers described her as kind without being soft, funny without trying, and focused without ever seeming cold. Outside of work and school, she maintained a strong connection with her family, especially her mom, Lisa, whom she called daily. It didn't matter how busy she was. That 5-minute check-in was never skipped. Her family wasn't just part of her life. It was her foundation. Reagan's friends noticed how she made space for people. She wasn't loud. She didn't seek attention. But people leaned toward her. She listened without interrupting and gave support without conditions. One symbol kept appearing in her sketches, her usernames, her art: the butterfly. Small, graceful, but strong. It became part of her identity, her quiet emblem of transformation and lightness. It wasn't meant to be profound. It was just something she loved. After her death, it became her signature, her memory, her mark. Reagan Tokes wasn't a statistic. She wasn't an article. She was a 21-year-old woman with plans, talent, and time she never got to use. Brian Lee Goldsby wasn't unknown to the justice system. Long before Reagan crossed his path, he had already shown what he was capable of. In 2010, he kidnapped and raped a pregnant woman in the city of Columbus. He didn't stop there. He robbed her, choked her, and left her terrorized. It was a brutal crime, one that should have carried long-term consequences. He was convicted and sentenced to 6 years in prison. By the time he was released in November 2016, he was classified as a Tier 3 sex offender, the most severe designation. That label should have signaled maximum oversight. But what followed wasn't close to maximum. After release, Goldsby was placed in transitional housing run by NISRI, Inc., a re-entry program contracted by the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, ODRC. The facility, known as EXIT, was supposed to ease former inmates back into society, but the structure was flawed. He was allowed to come and go during the day with little accountability. There were curfews, but no real-time tracking, no meaningful supervision, no person assigned to monitor whether he was following rules. Only a GPS ankle monitor logging his location into a system few were actively reviewing. The same man who once dragged a pregnant woman into terror had been quietly released, placed into the heart of a city, and told to rebuild his life, with no one truly watching. His freedom was intact. His pattern hadn't changed. And within weeks of his release, he began circling the edges of familiar behaviors. But this time, no alarm was raised. Shortly after his release, Brian Goldsby began committing armed robberies throughout Columbus's German Village neighborhood. He held victims at gunpoint. He demanded wallets, purses, and car keys. One woman was forced to drive with him to multiple locations while he emptied her accounts. These weren't isolated cases. These were warnings, but they weren't heard. In just 2 weeks, Goldsby was connected to at least 6 separate robberies. Victims filed police reports. Descriptions matched. But there was no system in place linking these incidents to his GPS data. The device strapped to his leg had been collecting everything: locations, timestamps, movement. But no one was actively watching. He was free to move, free to stalk, and free to plan. The boundaries meant to keep him away from vulnerable spaces didn't exist in practice. He could stand outside a college bar. He could pace through parking lots. He could follow a student to her car. And no one would stop him. On the night of February 8, 2017, he did exactly that. For weeks, his behavior escalated in plain view of the very systems designed to prevent it. The warnings were there, filed, documented, and ignored. By the time he encountered Reagan Tokes, the outcome wasn't unpredictable. It was the next step in a chain no one had broken. Have you ever trusted a system that was supposed to protect you? Let us know in the comments, because this case shows what happens when those systems fail. It was a typical Wednesday in Columbus. Temperatures hovered in the low 30s and patches of snow clung to the curbs. On campus, students bundled into jackets and moved through their routines. Reagan Tokes was one of them. That evening, she clocked in for her shift at Bodega, a popular spot in the short North District. Her shift ended around 9:45 p.m. She texted her father before leaving, a quick note to let him know she was heading home. It was a habit, a small thread of communication she kept with her family every day. Nothing in that moment felt unusual, but someone had been waiting. Brian Goldsby was already nearby. His ankle monitor placed him within steps of Reagan's car. Surveillance later confirmed what the GPS did not. He was watching. The walk from the restaurant to her vehicle took less than a minute. As she reached for the handle, he confronted her. There was a gun. There was no yelling. No bystander saw anything. He forced her into the driver's seat. She did what many would do, she complied, hoping that giving him what he wanted would keep her alive. He directed her to several ATMs. One by one, she withdrew small amounts of money. The surveillance footage shows her standing at a machine, shoulders drawn in, posture tight. She's not frantic. She's not visibly injured, but everything about her body language says she's holding herself together. It's just after 10:15 p.m. when the final withdrawal is made. He orders her back into the car. She drives again. What passed between them during those minutes isn't recorded, but the route tells a story. Winding roads, turns away from populated areas, a shift from neon storefronts to tree-lined trails. She wasn't being driven home. She was being taken somewhere far from help, somewhere no one would find her in time. At some point along the route, Goldsby directed Reagan to pull behind a building. There, hidden from passing cars, he sexually assaulted her. Forensic evidence would later confirm this, but Reagan never had a chance to tell anyone herself. What she endured in those moments remains something only her attacker could fully describe. Still, she complied. Still, she didn't resist. She did everything a person is taught to do when facing someone with a weapon. She followed his commands. She didn't run. She didn't scream. Afterward, he made her keep driving. By 10:30 p.m., they reached Scioto Grove Metro Park, a nature preserve located just 10 miles from Ohio State's campus. The park was closed. There were no cars in the lot, no night staff, only trees, winding trails, and the faint hum of passing traffic in the distance. The air was bitter, below freezing, with icy wind pressing through the branches. Reagan was ordered to remove her clothes. Then she was forced out of the car, barefoot, and walked ahead into the dark. He didn't shoot her right away. He made her move first. At some point, he raised the gun and fired 2 rounds into the back of her head. She collapsed to the frozen ground, alone and unclothed. There was no rush in his exit, no panic. He gathered her clothes, returned to the car, and left the park without being seen. He took her cell phone, wallet, and keys. He threw away her belongings, wiped down parts of the vehicle, and abandoned it in a neighborhood near his halfway house. Then he bought gloves and soap. By morning, February 9th, a man walking his dog through Scioto Grove stumbled onto a form lying off the trail. It wasn't immediately clear what he was looking at. A shape in the snow. A shadow. As he stepped closer, he saw skin. Hair. Motionless limbs. There were no footprints near the body except the ones leading away. She had been left like a discarded object. But she wasn't hard to find. She was out in the open. It only took one person to notice. It was already too late. Thursday, February 9, 2017, 1:30 p.m. A man walking his dog in Scioto Grove Metro Park spotted what looked like a person lying near a trail. At first, he wasn't sure. The cold had stiffened everything. But as he moved closer, the reality became unmistakable. He called 911. Police arrived quickly and secured the area. The victim was unclothed. There were no visible tire tracks nearby. No purse. No ID. Just a body in the quiet aftermath of violence. They didn't yet know her name, but they knew she had been executed. Hours earlier, Reagan's family had already begun calling friends and campus offices. She hadn't returned any texts. She hadn't made it home. It wasn't like her. Her roommates, worried by the silence, contacted police. Soon, missing person reports were filed. By the time the body was found, the timelines were already crossing. Friday, February 10th, Reagan's silver 1999 Acura was located in Grove City, not far from the halfway house where Brian Goldsby was living. The car had been abandoned and cleaned, but not well. Crime scene techs recovered cigarette butts from inside the vehicle. They also found traces of blood and other biological material. Those cigarette butts were run through CODIS, the national DNA database. The match came back fast. Brian Goldsby, a Tier 3 sex offender recently released from prison, now living under state supervision. But investigators needed more. They pulled data from the GPS monitor Goldsby was required to wear as part of his parole. The coordinates told a story. His path the night of February 8th matched Reagan's final hours. He had been outside Bodega. He had followed her to the ATMs. He had traveled to Scioto Grove Park. His movements placed him at nearly every location tied to her murder. But GPS alone wasn't enough. The next step would be to find what he'd left behind, the things he thought no one would notice. With the GPS data in hand, detectives began reconstructing Goldsby's actions before and after the murder. One key discovery came from a Walmart surveillance tape, recorded the morning of February 9th, just hours after Reagan was killed. In the footage, Goldsby is seen calmly walking the aisles. He picks up nitrile gloves, a bottle of Zest soap, and a box of hair dye. He doesn't appear rushed. He makes his purchases and leaves. The items were troubling. Investigators had already noted signs that Reagan's car had been wiped down. Her body had been left exposed, but her clothes were missing. The tub at Goldsby's halfway house was still damp. Now the surveillance video offered context. He wasn't panicked. He was covering his tracks. When questioned, Goldsby initially denied everything. He told officers that another man, someone named TJ, had forced him to participate. According to his story, this imaginary person was the one responsible for Reagan's death. But the story unraveled quickly. No evidence supported it. No witnesses had seen a second man. The GPS data, the video footage, the DNA. All of it pointed in one direction. Then came the jail phone call. Speaking with the mother of his child, Goldsby admitted to killing Reagan. He tried to justify his actions, but there was no justification to be found. The call was recorded. Prosecutors would later play it for the jury. The case was tightening. The timeline matched. The locations matched. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The public reaction was immediate and furious. How had a known violent offender, someone with a record as severe as Goldsby's, been released with such minimal oversight? Why weren't the GPS alerts being monitored in real time? Why were his earlier robberies not connected sooner? For Reagan's family, these weren't just questions. They were failures. Failures that cost their daughter her life. If you're still with us, consider sharing this video. Reagan's story is a reminder that one oversight can cost a life. By March 2017, prosecutors had built a case that left no room for reasonable doubt. A Franklin County grand jury returned an 18-count indictment against Brian Goldsby. The charges included aggravated murder, rape, kidnapping, aggravated robbery, and tampering with evidence, as well as firearm violations and repeat violent offender specifications. Each count reflected a piece of what Reagan Tokes endured, and each one carried weight. The trial began in March 2018, a little over a year after her death. For the jury, the first few days involved something rarely done, a court-sanctioned site visit. Jurors were escorted to the actual locations tied to the case: Bodega, the ATM machines, the parking lot, and finally, Scioto Grove Metro Park, where Reagan's body had been found. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors walked the jury through the evidence, piece by piece. DNA from the cigarette butts, surveillance images from the ATMs, the purchase receipts from Walmart, the audio from Goldsby's phone call in jail, the GPS tracking from his ankle monitor, showing his exact movements matching Reagan's last known locations. Nothing relied on inference. Everything was concrete. Then came the photos. Graphic crime scene images were introduced as part of the testimony. They were difficult to view. Some jurors looked away. But prosecutors argued that these images told the truth of what Reagan endured: her final position, her injuries, the distance she'd been made to walk without shoes or clothing. It wasn't there to provoke. It was there to clarify. On March 13, 2018, what would have been Reagan's 23rd birthday, the jury returned a verdict. Goldsby was found guilty on all counts. The penalty phase followed. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, arguing that the cruelty and premeditation justified it. But the jury could not reach a unanimous decision. Instead, they recommended a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court accepted that recommendation. Later in 2020, prosecutors attempted to reopen the penalty phase. They argued that procedural errors and juror confusion during deliberations might have influenced the outcome. But the appeal was eventually withdrawn, bringing the legal proceedings to a final close. Brian Goldsby will spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for many, that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of what needed to change. After Reagan's death, her family grieved. But they didn't stay quiet. They filed lawsuits against both the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, ODRC, and NISRI Inc., the halfway house operator responsible for monitoring Brian Goldsby after his release. The lawsuits claimed negligence, pointing to the lack of supervision, and the flawed decision to place a violent offender in transitional housing without proper oversight. But most of all, the Tokes family began asking questions, loudly and publicly, and people listened. The outrage extended far beyond Columbus. News reports highlighted how a man with Goldsby's record had been released with an ankle monitor that no one actively watched, and how his series of armed robberies in the weeks before Reagan's murder went unnoticed. Soon, that outrage turned into legislative momentum. In 2018, Ohio lawmakers introduced and passed the Reagan-Tokes Act, a direct response to the gaps exposed in the system. The law aimed to prevent future tragedies by strengthening the rules around how violent offenders are sentenced and supervised. One of its central features was indeterminate sentencing. Instead of giving violent felons a fixed end date, the law allows parole boards to extend prison time based on an inmate's behavior and rehabilitation progress. A 6-year sentence could become 8, 10, or more, depending on whether the offender has earned release. The law also imposed stricter GPS monitoring standards, requiring real-time reviews of location data and better coordination between parole officers, law enforcement, and housing providers. But not everyone supported the change. Defense attorneys and advocacy groups challenged the law in court, arguing that indeterminate sentencing gave too much power to prison officials and undermined judicial authority. The legal fight escalated, reaching the Ohio Supreme Court. In July 2023, the court issued a ruling. The Reagan-Tokes Act was constitutional. The decision confirmed that Ohio could hold violent offenders longer if their actions in prison justified it. It also validated the state's right to create stronger oversight mechanisms for people under post-release control. The ruling didn't undo what had happened, but it changed what could happen going forward. Thanks to the Tokes family's determination, Ohio's parole and reentry systems look different now. There's more accountability, more eyes on those who pose a threat, and more safeguards for those walking alone to their cars at night. In the months that followed Reagan's death, Ohio State University made a quiet, powerful gesture. They awarded her a posthumous degree in psychology, a symbol of the work she had already done and the future she never got to finish. Her name was read aloud. Her seat was left empty, but no one in that room believed she didn't belong. Reagan's family didn't stop at mourning. They created the Reagan-Tokes Memorial Foundation, an organization that now offers scholarships to students pursuing psychology and related fields, young people with hearts like hers. The foundation also funds self-defense programs, awareness campaigns, and school initiatives designed to protect and empower other young women. In a corner of the Ohio State campus, not far from the classrooms where she studied, sits a memorial garden planted in her honor. There's another at Scioto Grove Metro Park, where her life was taken. These places aren't loud, they aren't crowded, but they hold weight. Visitors often find small butterflies tucked into corners, on plaques, painted stones, or tied to branches. Some were placed by strangers, some by classmates, some by people who never knew her at all, but felt something when they heard her name. That butterfly wasn't just decoration. It was hers. Reagan sketched them into her artwork, signed them into her usernames, and found beauty in what they represented: transformation, softness, and strength. Her parents, Lisa and Toby, have spoken publicly about their loss, not to sensationalize it, but to prevent it from happening again. They talk about her dreams, her discipline, her kindness. They talk about the day everything changed, and they talk about the fight they took on afterward, turning unimaginable grief into action. They don't speak like people seeking pity. They speak like people still carrying love. Because Reagan was more than a case. She was more than an example. She was more than a headline. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a student. And above all, she was a life lived with purpose. Comment a butterfly icon below if Reagan's story moved you. Let's flood the feed with her symbol and never let her name fade into silence. Like, share, and subscribe to Whispered Evidence for more stories that matter.